Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't.
Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you here today with us on this Saturday, Easter weekend Saturday in West Marin, right on the coast. It's great to have you here at Commonweal. And welcome to those of you who are on the webinar and to those of you who are listening later or watching. It's great to have you here with us wherever you are joining us from as well. So I wanted to say a couple of words about the new school for those of you who are new to us or to Commonweal. The new school is a learning community. We like to call it a learning community. And we host conversations that are with thought leaders and change makers who champion the things that we love, which is finding meaning in a changing world and building and growing personal and community resilience. The new school is just one of about 25 plus other programs at Commonweal, and they all have to do with healing people and healing the planet. You can always find out more about the new school at tns.commonweal.org. I wanted to also thank our co-presenters, our partners, Point Reyes Books. All right, with that, I'm going to introduce our host and my co-director, Michael Lerner, and our honored guest, Jane Hirshfield. Thanks for joining us at the new school at Commonweal.
What a joy to be here. I asked some of you before if you were new to Commonweal. And for those who are, either online or here, we started about 48 years ago. I was walking in Bolinas and had a vision of a center for healing ourselves and healing the earth. And against all probability, we're still here. And it's grown from just absolutely hard scratch beginnings to where it is now, which, as Kira said, is a center that works in health and healing, education and the arts, and environment and justice, with a strong focus on resilience and the current polycrisis in which we're living. We have programs around the world, around the country, around California, and locally here in West Marin and the Bay Area. The new school is my favorite part of Commonweal. It's the place where I have more fun than anything else we do, because we can explore any subject and have civilized, interesting, trustworthy and trusting conversations with people who still think and people who still believe in the possibility that the human race can be a human race. So it is in that spirit that I am grateful and awed to introduce my friend and colleague, Jane Hirshfield. Jane, thank you for being with us. I will take a moment to introduce Jane to you, because even if some of you think you know who she is, her accomplishments in the arts and letters are really quite extraordinary. Jane is an American poet, essayist, and translator, called one of American poetry's central spokespersons for the biosphere, with a powerful commitment to environment and justice. Washington Post said she belongs among the modern masters. The New York Times Magazine said Hirshfield has written among some of the most important poetry in the world today, addressing the urgent immediacies of our time. She's an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her 10 books include numerous award-winning collections of her own poems, collections of essays, and edited and co-translated volumes of world writers from the deep past. Her work has been translated into 15 languages, and ranging from the political, ecological, and scientific to the metaphysical, personal, and passionate, Hirshfield praises the radiance of particularity and reckons the consequence of the daily. Her poems and essays traverse the crises of the biosphere, questions of social justice, and the myriad interior quandaries of heart, mind, and spirit. Her work lives at the intersection of facts and imagination, desire and loss, impermanency and beauty, all the dimensions of our shared existence within what one poem calls the pure democracy of being. In other words, Jane manages to capture the heart and soul of what we've been about at Commonweal for the last 48 years, that intersection of healing ourselves and healing the earth and finding the ways in which our stories and our felt experience can coexist and even thrive in a period of deep darkness in which we are presently living. So, Jane, again, welcome. We're so glad to have you here.
Well, thank you so very much. And it is, as always, a tremendous honor to be talking with you, and such a radiant thing to be at Commonweal, whose work I have observed from very close to the very beginning.
Wonderful.
And have had friends come emerge again, changed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I asked if you would start with a reading, because that's what people came to hear. And so we'll start with a reading, and then we will move into a conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I hope it's what you came to hear. You know, maybe you just came to hear a conversation, but you're going to get some poems. So I thought for what I would read that I would give you, I divided up the reading with lots of poems, more than I will read, that have to do with various themes that we had talked about beforehand as things we might touch on. And so the first few poems that I have picked are poems that speak in one way or another about shared fate and intimacy. And I thought I would start with a poem I haven't been reading very much since this new book, The Asking, came out. And it's one of the new poems from the opening section that, you know, since all the books before it. But because I know that one of the things that Michael likes to do in these conversations is look at the arc of a life, this felt like a good poem to open with. Again, I enter my life. Again, I enter my life, calligraphed each day newly in a language strange to me, awkward, its letters and etymologies, even its ink, unfamiliar. Its hours set in a country where others walk side by side, sure of direction, appearing to know which shop they're considering, and if it's tomatoes, shoes, or aspirin they're wanting to buy. On the subway maps, shapes and colors are clear, but not the names of the stations. My ears refuse their conductor. My feet move toward each slid-open door. Each day it grows harder to say how all this happened and continues to happen. Perhaps some changed life is attempting to enter me. The way clay and wheel turn the hands of the potter into the hands of a potter. Nor is my life addressed with a singular pronoun. It's I, a fish school of mutual fellow traveling incomprehensions. It's you demanding always the plural and formal. It's he, she, it, taking an oddly specialized somehow subjective grammar. Not theirs, not mine. The verb tense, past, future, imperfect. The weather, though already changing, still bearably humid, hospitable even to a multicellular flock that each night forgets entirely how it should waken, into a story, into a self, or a murmuration. So probably if you are local, here in Marin, almost every year, not every single year, there is a murmuration of starlings when you see them, flocking up by Terra Linda in the Kaiser parking lot there. You can watch them, and it is astonishing. And is that one being or 10,000 beings or 40,000 beings? And so, this book, The Asking, has 50 years of poems in it. And you can't help but after, once you're going to be bringing out a book with 50 years of poems in it, you can't help but get a little retrospective. And so, again, I enter my life. And here I am, still trying to figure out how come everybody else seems to know what they're doing so well. And yet for me, it is a bewilderment. My feet want to go out every subway door that opens. It's like, what's there? So we'll see. I'll give you next the poem from which the book took its title, The Asking. A little bit of prelude for it, which is every New Year's morning, I write a poem to start the year as a writing poet, no matter what else the year might bring. Every December 31st, by midnight, I have to have finished a rather demonically thorough house cleaning, which is a Japanese tradition to go into the new year with every surface, everything, dusted, cleaned, wiped, and then you're supposed to open the windows and jump off the furniture shouting to drive the old year out. The year that I wrote this poem was January 1st, 2021, and so you will remember at that point the election was settled, but January 6th was about to happen. So it was a strange limbo period. And because of that sense that all was not quite settled, as we have found out it surely was not, I continued doing what I had been doing for the entire 5 years before, which was every day taking some action. And the action referred to in this poem, when about 3/4 of the way through, it talks about postcards and stamps. I've pretty much settled on what I'm back to doing again now, sending postcards to people from a list, urging them to register and suggesting why perhaps they might want to register with a certain party rather than the other certain party. So anyhow, here's the poem. Counting New Year's morning, what powers yet remain to me? The world asks, as it asks daily, and what can you make, can you do to change my deep, broken, fractured? I count this first day of another year, what remains. I have a mountain, a kitchen, 2 hens, can admire with 2 eyes the mountain, actual, recalcitrant, shuffling its pebbles, sheltering foxes and beetles, can make black-eyed peas and collards, can make from last year's late ripening persimmons a pudding, can climb a stepladder, change the bulb in a track light. For years, I woke each day first to the mountain, then to the question. The feet of the new sufferings followed the feet of the old, and still they surprised. I brought salt, brought oil to the question, brought sweet tea, brought postcards and stamps. For years, each day, something. Stone did not become apple. War did not become peace. Yet joy still stays joy, Sequins, stay sequins, words still bespangle, bewilder. Today I woke without answer. The day answers, unpockets a thought as though from a friend. Don't despair of this falling world, not yet. Didn't it give you the asking? So I had others, but I think I'll move to the next thematic section, which was science and poetry, because more and more in recent years I have become close friends with scientists, and the vocabulary of science, which is so much the vocabulary of the current era, feels not outside of the vocabulary of the lyric poem, which is the expression and the investigation and the deeper questioning of our interior lives. And so this poem from a couple books ago is called My Proteins. I wrote it in 2013 after having read a piece in the New York Times science section that scientists had figured out how itch works. And for some reason, I just knew immediately that this had to become a poem. The poem kind of wanders on from itch to the microbiome, you know, the millions of other beings who are inside of us and collaboratively making our life as we know it, our moods, our intelligence, our health, our resilience, our despair. Proteins, most of you probably know, get their name from the Greek god Proteus, who folds and unfolds, changes shape. So proteins are the shape shifters, as he was in the gods. And I think that's enough preface. My proteins. They have discovered, they say, the protein of itch, natriuretic polypeptide B, and that it travels its own distinct pathway inside my spine, as do pain, pleasure, and heat. A body, it seems, is a highway, a cloverleaf crossing, well built, well traversed. Some of me going north, some going south. 90% of my cells, they have discovered, are not my own person. They are other beings inside me. As 96% of my life is not my life. Yet I, they say, am they, my bacteria and yeasts, my father and mother, grandparents, lovers, my drivers talking on cell phones, my subways and bridges, my thieves, my police who chase myself night and day. My proteins, apparently also me, fold the shirts. I find in this crowded metropolis a quiet corner where I build of not me Lego blocks a bench, pigeons, a sandwich of rye bread, mustard, and cheese. It is me and is not the hunger that makes the sandwich good. It is not me, then is the sandwich, a mystery neither of us can fold, unfold, or consume. So science and poetry moves pretty quickly into poetry, science, and the crisis of the biosphere. And so this poem speaks to that. It came again from, a New York Times science story that came out in the middle of the pandemic. It was very beautifully done with photographs and all of that, about mosses that live in the Mojave Desert, which is not exactly a terrain one would think of mosses thriving in. So the epigraph is from the Times. In the Mojave Desert, a translucent crystal offers bryophytes much-needed respite from the heat of the sun. Mosses. For hypolithic mosses, it seems 4% of daylight is right. They live, the headline says, by sheltering under a parasol of translucent quartz. The crystal scatters the light's ultraviolet, dilutes its heat, traps the night's condensed moisture to moss-sized rain. I think of these mosses and consider, perhaps we too are mosses, evolving to the parch of our self-made Mojaves, unable to bear the full brightness, the full seeing, to recognize fully the Amazon burning, the Arctic burning, the monarch's smoke-colored missing migration. An experiment not meant to last. And yet, we found shelter within it. We pondered our lives and the lives of others, thirsted, slept. To the implausible green of existence, for better, for worse, we offered our 4% portion of praises. For better, for worse, our 4% portion of comprehension. So just as an aside, I am being more and more translated into other languages, and you don't know what's going to be a problem. And it turns out, well, somebody translating you into Czech, for better, for worse, was baffling to him. He didn't know that as the phrase of the marriage vow. And yet the whole point of that ending is our marriage vow to this earth, to the green of existence. And so all I could do was answer his question and wish him good luck. You just have no idea. So I'm going to skip other activism poems, including the sort of best known of the activism poems. If you want me to ask for one later, I could do that. I wanted not to omit the recognition of the conflict zones of the world right now and the seemingly insoluble ability of human beings to find another way to work things out. So I'll choose two shorter poems. I write a lot of shorter poems, and yet I've been reading from this book longer ones. So this one came after having been in Syria in 2008, which was before their civil war. The little group of writers I was traveling with, we spoke to many university students. And when the war broke out, I could not help but wonder what had become of these students who every place we read, they would, mob us afterwards. Each of us would be surrounded by a group of students asking us questions. And I knew surely, some of them would have ended up on one side of that war, some of them would have ended up on the other, some of them would have ended up killed as bystanders, some of them are surely now in refugee camps with their children. And so this poem came out of that. Nothing explicitly about Syria in here. Nothing confining it to Syria. Words. Words are loyal. Whatever they name, they take the side of. As the word courage will afterward grip just as well the frightened girl soldier who stands on one side of barbed wire, the frightened boy soldier who stands on the other. Death's clay. They look at each other with wide open eyes, and words that love peace, love gossip, refuse to condemn them. If I have to take anybody's side, I will take the side of the powerless. And for some reason, I have been drawn, since the most recent events, to the poem that I wrote 3 days after 9/11 happened, foreseeing what did happen, writing my little spell against it happening, which of course did no good at all. But the poem is refusing the energies of revenge, which, by the afternoon of 9/11 were already rising. The dead do not want us dead. The dead do not want us dead. Such petty errors are left for the living. Nor do they want our mourning. No gift to them, not rage, not weeping. Return one of them, any one of them, to the earth, and look. Such foolish skipping, such telling of bad jokes, such feasting. Even a cucumber, even a single anise seed, feasting. Now, I know there's plenty of people who think the dead do want revenge, but I don't believe a word of it. I think that anyone who had the chance to come back to this world would just want to bask in it and tell bad jokes to their grandchildren. I could be wrong. I don't know. The next section, I'll have to figure out which of these to choose. Poems of praise of this world. I guess I'll choose the one from the newest section. It follows pretty closely from that last poem. Each morning calls us to praise this world that is fleeting. Each morning, waking amidst the not ever before, dressing inside the not ever again, under sunlight or cloud, brushing the hair, not yet arrived at the end crimped finish, drinking coffee and buttering toast, permitted to slip into coat, into shoes. I go out, I count myself part, carrying only a weightless shadow whose each corner joins and departs from the shadows of others. Mortal, alive among others, equally fragile. And with luck, for days even sometimes, this luxury, this extra gift, able to even forget it. Now that's bad Zen practice, I suppose. You're supposed to live as if you remember your death at every moment, but sometimes we forget. Sometimes we just bask. Another theme that came up was permeability, and I'm going to give you a slightly lighter poem. Even the light poems remember death. It's always sneaking around in a corner somewhere. But for the cat lovers in the room, a small-sized mystery. And don't forget permeability, right? So it's about a cat and it's about other things too. A small-sized mystery. Leave a door open long enough, a cat will enter. Leave food, it will stay. Soon, on cold nights, you'll be saying, "Excuse me," if you want to get out of your chair. But one thing you'll never hear from a cat is "excuse me," nor Einstein's famous theorem, nor the quality of mercy is not strained. In the dictionary of cat, mercy is missing. In this world where much is missing, a cat fills only a cat-sized hole. Yet your whole body turns toward it again and again because it is there. So, we love many things in this world, including our fellow beings. Two more themes. One, a theme which runs throughout my work from beginning to end, saying yes to the difficult. And there's an earlier poem about this I picked out. The weighing. The heart's reasons seen clearly, Even the hardest will carry its whip marks and sadness and must be forgiven. As the drought-starved eland forgives the drought-starved lion who finally takes her, enters willingly then the life she cannot refuse, and is lion, is fed, and does not remember the other. So few grains of happiness measured against all the dark, and still the scales balance. The world asks of us only the strength we have, and we give it. Then it asks more, and we give it. So the last theme that I had picked out for this reading was poems that have to do with loss, death, illness, because we are at Commonweal, where so many people have faced these things and come forth larger rather than smaller for having been able to pause and look deeply in one another's companionship. And I was going to read you a series of poems, but that takes you 5 minutes, so instead I will just read you one. I wrote this poem at the end of a period of time when there were a lot of deaths. Most of my nuclear family died during a 3-year period. There were the public deaths of world tragedies. Several of my beloved elder poets had died. And so it is thinking both about specific deaths and anyone's death. It was like this, you were happy. It was like this, you were happy, then you were sad, then happy again, then not. It went on. You were innocent or you were guilty. Actions were taken or not. At times you spoke, at other times you were silent. Mostly, it seems, you were silent. What could you say? Now it is almost over. Like a lover, your life bends down and kisses your life. It does this not in forgiveness. Between you, there is nothing to forgive. But with the simple nod of a baker at the moment he sees the bread is finished with transformation. Eating, too, is a thing now only for others. It doesn't matter what they will make of you or your days. They will be wrong. They will miss the wrong woman, miss the wrong man. All the stories they tell will be tales of their own invention. Your story was this. You were happy, then you were sad. You slept, you awakened. Sometimes you ate roasted chestnuts, sometimes persimmons. On to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. It's such a rich field of work. I was saying to you in the time we had before we came on that I just get lost in the variety and richness of the work you've done. And one of the things I want to do in our time together is a little bit formally to weave in some of the things about you that listeners may not know. So, for example, I want to weave in that your 10 poetry books include the newly published The Asking, New and Selected Poems, which you've been reading from, Ledger in March 2020, The Beauty, long listed for the National Book Award, Given Sugar, Given Salt, which I read and loved, a finalist for the 2001 National Book Critics Circle Award, and After, named a Best Book of 2006 by the Washington Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, and England's Financial Times. And then your 2 collections of essays, 9 Gates, Entering the Mind of Poetry, and 10 Windows, How Great Poems Transform the World have become classics. Your 4 books collecting and co-translating the work of world poets from the past include Ink Dark Moon, Love Poems of Komachi and Shikibu, Women of the Ancient Japanese Court, Women in Praise of the Sacred, 43 Centuries of Spiritual Poetry by Women, Mirabai Ecstatic Poems, which I've loved, The Heart of Haiku on Matsuo Basho, which was named an Amazon Best Book. So I'm going to sort of weave these things in because I want listeners, present and future, to understand the depth of this work, which is extraordinary. And so I want to start with a deceptively simple question. At least I think it's deceptively simple. I think many of us, myself included, harbor what I would call in some seed form the inner poet, right? We all have a feeling that if we really were to set our minds to it, we might write a poem that was worth people listening to or thinking. And some of us, certainly in the Cancer Help Program, we've done this often, where we have evenings where we read poetry from previous participants in the Cancer Help Program, and people write poetry. So my question to you, Brother David Steindl-Rast, who's a great favorite of mine among the Christian mystics of our time, once said in a Commonweal conversation, he said, there are times when only a poem can carry the freight.
Yes.
There are times when only a poem can carry the freight. And we just had a conversation with a wonderful story catcher named Christina Baldwin here two days ago, where we were talking about the immense power of story in our lives. So I was thinking to myself, and I wondered if you agree to that or not, whether poem is kind of an almost ultimate condensation of story. I don't know whether you agree with that or not. And whether the power of poem to uniquely be able to carry the freight some of the time is because it reduces story to its sort of essential elements. So is that something you can reflect on?
Is that a deceptively simple question? I don't think so. Yeah, so what is a story? And there are multiple definitions of story. I mean, one of them, the main one people think of, is narrative. Mm-hmm. But another, I think, understanding we take, especially when you're speaking with, real storytellers, is it is a way to transform and deepen our understanding of the world. Mm-hmm. And so, what is your story? When you say, what is your story to somebody, you're not necessarily asking them, I was born in New York City and, grew up on such and so. Sometimes what you're asking them is, how are you? How do you feel the world today? What's your story today? And I do think that poems are not always shorter. It's like the Iliad and the Odyssey, pretty long. The Dante's Commedia, pretty long. But yes, one of the powers of poetry is to do at the shortest possible length, distilled, condensed, intensified, this work of transformation of understanding. And when we write a poem, that is the work we are doing for ourselves. We are changing our own understanding. A poem that has not made a discovery of something, even if it's very small, isn't really a poem yet. It is something, in the shape of a poem. But until the discovery is made, it's not a poem. I, by the way, have a theory to what you were speaking of earlier, that every person I know has written and will write 3 great poems over the course of their life. They just may not know that they've done it because they can't see clearly enough. I have had friends who don't read poetry, don't think of themselves as writers of poetry, but something large happens in their life and they write something. And because I am the poet they happen to know, they show it to me. And it is great. It is truly a great poem. And so I don't think that the making of great poetry is confined to what we will find on the shelves of that section of the library. I think everybody at some point, and sometimes your poems might be done in color on canvas, or they might be done with notes on a guitar or piano or sitar. But all human beings have the insistent, demanding urge to create, to find a new relationship to the world, and art exists as the vessel of our doing that. Have I answered your deceptive question?
You have. And so let me carry this line of questioning further. So for those of us who may feel that seed of the inner poet within us, and may even have it activated by this conversation, what makes a poem a poem?
I think it is the discovery.
It's the discovery.
It's the discovery. One of the things that I have been saying in recent years is that, science and engineering and all of the indispensable forms of world repair that are practical and absolutely necessary for our viable future, they exist to answer questions that can be answered. Can we find renewable energy and a way to produce it that isn't more demanding of the earth than it gives back? I believe that is an answerable question. We will find that. Art exists to answer the unanswerable questions. And so what you discover is not some formula that will set your life at ease forever after, but you will discover something that gives you, in Robert Frost's unsurpassable phrase, a momentary stay against confusion, and a way to re-knit your grief or bewilderment or frustration or rage into a larger understanding. And these are discoveries that can only be made again and again because they can't be hung on to. They're not, rungs on a ladder that you can stay holding on. You have to keep climbing, and your life will give you other dilemmas, other griefs. And each time we need to find the new discovery. But for me, it is that sense of, as I said, a changed relationship to the world, and one which is larger rather than diminished. Art is the opposite of slogan. Slogan narrows understanding. Art expands it. And it dips its brush into the mystery.
Many times, I'm part of a little community of us that exchanges poetry almost daily, 4 or 5 times a week, as just part of our practice. And I realize we talk about other things in this little group, but the poems are what carry the freight of the conversations, and they bring back, the transcendent, or whatever one wants to call that larger reality, in ways that nothing else that we write brings it back. I notice a similarity, not in all poems, but very often that discovery in a poem, in the structure of a poem, happens in the last line or two. Or it's the point at which the thing happens, right? Now, that seems to me to be in transferred or open form the same thing that happens with a joke.
Oh, absolutely.
In other words, there's a punchline.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And the poem has a punchline too. And when I listen to the songs of Leonard Cohen or Bob Dylan, there's an extraordinary way in which, in their work, which is not the same as this. They move back and forth between the higher world and the lower, or whatever you want to call it, world. This movement up and down, which in a poem can happen throughout the poem, but often happens in that last piece. So how do you reflect on that quality of a poem in the context of other forms that also use discovery as a punchline or as a mechanism for moving back and forth between worlds?
So I was right with you till you asked the actual question, and then I'm thinking, So let's stay with jokes for a moment, because I have an idea that I had and didn't pursue when I was a poet in residence for a neuroscience group at UCSF, was put people in an fMRI machine and read them a joke that reliably makes people, sort of startle and laugh, and then read them a lyric poem which makes them, sigh or tears come to the eyes, pretty reliably. And I was very curious what would be the same and what would be different in the image of what was happening in the brain. And my speculation is that something is quite the same, because often it is this moment of, oh, I was seeing it that way and now I'm seeing it this way. So that's the same. What I'm curious about is anything different between laughing and tears coming to your eyes? Subjectively, it certainly feels different, but what's actually going on, in our neurons? So that was my project that I did not do, because I thought, if they put me in the fMRI machine, they'd discover I have no memory and I'd become a patient rather than their artist in residence. And that just wouldn't do. I didn't want to frighten them by letting them look at me. But I do think, in music, it would be a change of key very often.
Right.
And when the refrain returns, it returns differently each time, because you have been through a journey over the course of the song that the same words coming back have a deepened and changed movement. And there are certain poems, please don't ask for an example, where, the first line and the last line are the same, and yet when you arrive at the last line, its meaning has been utterly changed. I can't recite it by heart, but Cavafy's great poem Ithaca is an example of this. Poems that they're working more the way music does, in that way of recurrence and change, recurrence and change. One thing that interests me is, what about the paintings? We fall into a painting which is static. Poems occur over time, music occurs over time. A painting, the time is in us. And yet certain paintings you look at and you have an epiphanic experience, where you fall into the painting and the world's colors are changed because you have spent time in it. And all of this, of course, is collaborative. Words on the page without a reader feeling them, having their own associations to them, they're ink on a page. They're nothing. They're empty. And so really, one of the reasons I think that poems often create their changed understanding at the very end is because you want the poem to continue doing its work in the person after the words have stopped. It's like, rooms that are resonant, where if you clap your hands, you hear the echo. Good poems are like that. They keep doing things in you after the end of the poem.
We were talking about the power of Picasso's Guernica. And if we take Guernica and say Rothko, Guernica actually tells a story.
Yes.
So some paintings tell stories. And so even though it's immediate, you look at the painting and you see a story in it. A Rothko, by contrast, is or perhaps much of abstract art has a different impact.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how would you describe those two experiences of paintings in terms of what you just said about paintings? That one actually does have an implied narrative, another brings you in a completely different way, it would seem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So a Rothko to me is more like, a chord in music.
Yeah.
That you just deepen and deepen and you
Yeah.
fall into it. And Guernica, which I was just quite recently thinking about, and this will seem like a detour, forgive me. So in vision, the way our eyes work, there is this thing called saccade. And in a saccade, we do this all the time because of the way our physiological vision works. The area of clear focus and bright colors, the fovea, is very small. And the rest of our vision is this kind of impressionistic blur, but the mind fills it in, so we believe the entire world is detailed, even though we might only be seeing detail, the toes of your boots. Saccade, the eye jumps. So when you're reading, the eye jumps from phrase to phrase, from focus point to focus point. When you're walking around in the world, your eyes are always jumping a little. So you are stitching the larger world together and making a story, which in fact, at the physiological level, there is no story. Our brains are making the story. Guernica is an image of saccade, of the bombing of that village and who was affected by it, how, including the person flying the plane, dropping the bombs. Mm-hmm. And so it feels to me as a work of art very true to the underlying experience, almost our physiological experience, which is, to me, it doesn't feel like a narrative. It feels like standing inside wind blowing so hard you can barely keep standing and you're being pelted from all sides. That is how I experience that painting. Even if I am perhaps wrong and somebody knows the story and can say, no, this means this and that means that. But for that painting that I've looked at since I was a child when it used to hang in New York, it just feels to me a 360-degree world of suffering. So there is content, there is war, there is violence, there is what human beings do to each other and to the animals because of that horse, of course. But the Rothko is almost the other end of the spectrum of what art can give us. Art gives us connection to experiences that we may not be having at this moment in person. It is someone's experience that is put in a vessel which is transferable from one person to the other. Mm-hmm. And so, I have never been in a war zone. I have never been bombed. I know a little something about what it is like because other people's art has shown me. Mm-hmm.
You have been, and we talked about this before we started, quite private about your personal life in your poetry and in your conversations with interviewers. And so I'm consciously aware when I ask you that you may say, I won't talk about that or whatever you choose to do. But I have your permission to ask. And so you were born actually almost exactly a decade after me on East 20th Street in New York City. And I think I was probably almost born in the same hospital. I don't know that, but a decade apart. You graduated from Princeton in 1973 in the school's first graduating class to include women as freshmen. You received a lay ordination in Soto Zen at the San Francisco Zen Center in '79, but you have expressed dismay when people describe you as a Zen poet. So starting with the easy question, what was your dismay when people have often described you as a Zen poet? Why were you dismayed?
Right. That is an easy question.
Right.
So I was dismayed because I know that most people out in the world, not including anyone in this room, I'm sure, have weird ideas about what Zen or Buddhism means. You know, they hear the word emptiness and detachment, and I don't care for detachment, but you know, emptiness can also be translated spaciousness. Mm-hmm. But they hear nihilism, and especially, you know, we're talking 50 years of all of this at this point in my life. It was 50 years ago that I first entered formal Zen training. And I just didn't want ideas to get in the way of the poems. I didn't want wrong ideas. I also, for that matter, didn't want right ideas. Because if you're reading my poem and you're looking for, where's the transience in this poem? You're not seeing the poem itself. And so I have always wanted, you know, if I have to be identified, the label I'm willing to live under is, oh, she's a human poet. Yeah. And, you know, of course, everything that people love to put labels on things. They love to hang the coat on the correct coat rack. And yes, I am a woman. Yes, I am an American. Yes, I was born, you know, in such and such a year and lived in such and such a place. So am I a California poet? Well, of course I'm a California poet. I live in California. Do I think it does my poems any good for someone to call them California poems? Not really. No, you know, they are. But I hope, and have been so far finding out it seems to be the case, that people who don't live in the San Francisco Bay Area, when I say mountain, they know what I mean. They don't have to go, oh, her and Mount Tam, they're really an item. You know, labels are not useful. Labels are narrowings, and I'm interested in very particular and shareable. And for people to bring their own mountain to my mountain poems.
That's interesting because I had a Fulbright fellowship in 1965-66 in Rio, and Mark Strand was there at the same time. He was just making the transition from being a painter to a poet, very engaged with Elizabeth Bishop's poetry. And we became friends, and subsequently he introduced me to Richard Howard and Donald Justice. And so I love Mark's work, I love Richard Howard's work, I love Donald Justice's work, but I feel further away from them. They feel to me like East Coast poets, okay? Whereas, you know, Gary Snyder and people like that, I get a real feeling, of a West Coast sensibility that is not universal, but that even though I'm a New York City boy, born and raised in New York and educated on the East Coast, but I've inhabited for over 50 years this landscape and this culture. I often think of people on the East Coast as wearing their intelligence like this, and on the West Coast, it seems to me intelligence is more distributed over the whole body, you know. We're more outdoors and so on. So you've said that, you know, you just happen to live in California, but do you sense in any way coastal sensibilities in poetry? I know that's an impossible question because I can think of East Coast poets that don't have that sensibility, but there is for me a distance from Mark and the others I mentioned, Richard Howard and Donald Justice, that I can't engage with in quite the same way. Maybe it's because my understanding of poetry is somewhat not deep enough, but I engage more easily with poetry that comes out of this landscape. What do you make of that?
So first of all, I think anybody is allowed to have any set of preferences that they want.
Yeah, for sure.
None of us loves everything.
No.
And I, for example, I love Mark Strand's poetry, which I feel deeply influenced by his time in South America. So he brought the whole South American surrealist tradition into American poetry
wonderful.
by having translated probably during the time that you met him.
Yeah.
And he was bringing us, Carlos Drummond de Andrade and all these voices which came into me because I was the next generation and could grow up on these poems. So I love Mark Strand's poetry. I'm not too keen on Richard Howard's, forgive me. I just think we all have our particular set of antennae of what we will be moved by. It is certainly, as a large generalization, true that West Coast poets speak more through the natural world and East Coast poets speak more through the cultural world. But then I can name so many exceptions, instantly, that for me, it isn't useful. I want to find not even the poet I love, I want the poem I love. And I'm not very interested in schools or historical French thing. I know it's all real. It's just not my relationship to poetry.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Mine is, and of course we know, Robert Frost, New England farmer poet, born in San Francisco. Robinson Jeffers, earliest environmental poet in the American tradition, born in Philadelphia. It's like you and I, born in New York, living in Marin. So I'm just, maybe it's because I don't have a good enough memory to keep the taxonomies straight, but I'm not that, like anybody else, I love gossip. And, these friendship circles, hearing who you got to meet at that time through Mark, I'm really interested. And yet, it's not my primary relationship. My primary relationship is with one poem at one moment that I happen to fall in love with. And when I was a child in New York City, there I was, East Coast influences all around me, growing up, family, East Coast, all the way back. I took my allowance money at age 7 and went to the local stationery store that sold a few of those, little books on spiral-bound display at the front, and looked at them all to see what I wanted to bring home. And I bought a book of Japanese haiku. Who can explain it?
Amazing.
I didn't know I was going to end up, practicing Zen full-time for so many years. I just, as a child, in a totally urban world, saw these poems, which I could not have understood in the way that I would now, and went, oh, I like that. And in some way, my whole life has consisted of following that Peter Popper Press book of Japanese haiku.
Beautiful. Another easy question. When did you first have an inkling that you might be a poet?
Well, I had forgotten this completely, but after my first book came out from a very small press in 1982, book has vanished, fortunate for everyone. There's 3 poems from it in here. So I was 29, and my mother pulled out from her bottom dresser drawer one of those big pieces of paper that they give you when you're learning how to write, big brown piece with the blue lines on it. And on it I had written, I want to be a writer when I grow up. So...
A writer?
A writer, well, yes. And it was pretty much all through my childhood poetry because I have no gift for narrative. I can't invent a plot to save my life. I have maybe 3 poems in my entire opus that tell story. So it was always poetry. But, I was 7 years old. What did I know?
Do you think that disinclination to write narrative is related to your repeated phrase that you have no memory?
I think it's connected, yeah. If you have no memory, you can't remember the stories.
Right. So if you have no memory, relatively speaking, and I don't have a lot either. I share that with you. But what occupies the space that memory occupies for most people?
What's here with me in the present moment? You know, it's not that if some, you know, dreadful thing has unfolded, it's not that I can't ruminate on it for a day or two, but ask me 2 weeks later and all the details are gone. It's a wonderful thing. It makes you impossible to hold a grudge because you just can't remember what the grudge would have been. And I've been this way since childhood. You know, it's not aging. It will make aging better because I don't have so much to lose.
But that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating that, do you think that this, shall we call it gift, of not being burdened by memory has deeply affected your art?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I once, many years ago, happened to be walking around the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art with a little group of people, and one of them who I didn't know was the scientist Linné Dell, who figured out that the hippocampus is, you know, quite central to memory. And I told him, you know, all my life I've just, you know, I've never hung on to things well. And he asked me 7 questions. And to each of them I said, no, can't do that well, can't do that well, no. And then he looked at me and he said, well, you know, hippocampi, they do come in different sizes, and yours might perhaps be on the smaller end. But really, look what a good job you've done of turning your life towards things you can do in the present moment. So Zen practice and poetry. And, you know, people think I have a good memory because something always arises. You know, I'll remember something to say, but I have the feeling that other people have a whole shelf of somethings they can pick one from. And I only have whatever it is, whatever fish comes to this moment's bait. And so, of course, I do remember some things. And, you know, I remember the thing about my mother giving me the piece of paper, A, because it was kind of shocking and important, so it made an impression. But also, I've told the story a bunch of times. And so you remember the ones you repeat, but I'm always pretty much inventing it from scratch, with the company of whatever happens to be floating about in this moment's pond. And, you know, I'm rather grateful for all the penalties of the screen and how much it has separated us from the living, sensual world of walking around in. And I am much less separated than I worry about the young growing up inside their phones, perhaps. But for me, one of the great advantages of the screen has been Wikipedia. You know, if I don't remember a fact,
It's
I
right
can
there.
get it. It's pretty fast. It's pretty handy.
I call her she who knows all. You know, yeah. So this may be a question that you don't relate to because of that memory question, but nonetheless, you've mastered a lot of poetry. You mentioned, you know, Homer, Dante, and obviously you know the whole trajectory of world poetry going forward. And also you've experienced and translated and written in all series of different cultures. So there's both the narrative arc of the history of poetry and the arc of all the different cultures of poetry. So how do you understand, or what is the story that you tell yourself in your mind about what it says about the evolution of human consciousness, of this arc from Homer to the present and the many streams in the river of poetry?
Yeah.
When I grew up, I mean, my father actually was a Jewish immigrant from Russia who got one of, 2 scholarships to Yale from the New Haven public schools. And he planned to be a poet. But when he told his advisor that he wanted to teach poetry and literature, the advisor said, as a Jew, you'll never get a job teaching literature. You better go to the social sciences, which he did. But I grew up with my father reciting from memory. My father and my mother, my wife Charlotte remembers this very well, they would help each other, recite these long narrative poems, The Raven and, all kinds of things like that. So I grew up, and then in my early experiences of poetry was very involved with 19th century rhyming narrative poetry. So it's a whole different story now, right? And so how do you make sense or make meaning of this historic trajectory, but also the many streams? How do you hold that together?
Yeah. Oh, I could talk for an hour about that. I'll try not to.
Well, let's go for it.
No. So, rhyme and meter, poetry goes back to before writing.
Yeah.
It is a pre-literate tradition.
Yeah.
And rhyme and meter help you remember things.
Right.
And remember things accurately. So not like the children's game of telephone where the sentence gets repeated and it's totally different, 15 children later, but like 30 days hath September. That's the one oral memory thing that most of us still do. How many days are there in July? You recite this little rhymed limerick. Then writing comes along, and eventually people stop relying on oral memory. Poetry keeps the strengths from that pre-literate time. It keeps vividness. It keeps the work it was doing at that time, not only the work of the Wikipedia of its age, but also the work of transformation. So poems, the earliest lyric poems, love poems, elegies, death poems, poems of work songs, I'm sorry to say war poems, they helped people through large demanding transitions. And what I see as the greatest story of the arc of 4,300 years of poetry that I'm aware of is, as with human beings and our social structures, it has become ever more broadly democratic. So experiences that were not considered part of lyric poetry enter lyric poetry. People who were not considered eligible to be poets, like your father, become eligible. And so you don't find poems of men writing about the birth of their children anywhere in the world until Galway Canal does it. A new subject matter entered poetry because that was the work that poetry in our free verse, democratic, ever-expanding world became able to do. So sometimes new subjects come because the world changes, and sometimes new subjects come because the ability to turn something into lyric poetry suddenly walks through the door. The other great story that affects modern poetry, contemporary poetry, is that story of translation. That, Japanese and Chinese and Indian and indigenous poems all became available pretty much during the 20th century. So even a Western poet is influenced by classical Chinese and Japanese poetry. Everybody is, whether they think they are or not, because at the beginning of the 20th century, you got the Imagist movement. And the same is true in painting. You can see when Japanese screens entered the lexicon of the visual arts. And you just look and you go, look at that. And so this broadening of possibility and expansion of possibility, and I think that will continue. There are things I must be blind to, that some poet, if the world makes it through this eye of the perilous needle that we are already inside of, and if 150 years from now there are poets, they will be writing about things that I didn't realize could become poems.
Beautiful. The Ink Dark Moon, your co-translation of the work of the two foremost women poets in classical era Japan, was instrumental in bringing tanka, a 31-syllable Japanese poetic form, to the attention of American poets. So tanka and haiku both have nothing to do, as far as I know, with rhyme, and is that correct, or do they have to do with rhyme?
Sound matters the way it matters in free verse now,
Okay.
but Japanese only has 5 sounds that can appear at the end of the words, and so rhyme would have been boring. What
see.
they do have is something akin to meter, so 575 and 57577 syllable counts.
Right.
And so they were memorable because they were in meter, and they were recognized as poetry because they kept this pattern.
I get it. And also, just again, I'm going to insert these little pieces for people. You served as chancellor of the Academy of American Poets for 5 years, 2012, 2017. In 2019, you were elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And I love the quote from, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, Czesław Miłosz, is that?
Oh, nobody pronounces it the same. I tried to imitate how his American wife said it, which was Czesław Miłosz.
Okay.
But really, you know, we used to say coleslaw meatloaf when we first heard of him. It was impossible.
So he wrote, I mean, he's such an astonishing person, and he wrote, a profound empathy for the suffering of all living beings. It is precisely this I praise in the poetry of Jane Hirshfield. The subject of her poetry is our ordinary life among other people and our continuing encounter with everything earth brings us, trees, flowers, animals, and birds. In its highly sensuous detail, her poetry illuminates the Buddhist virtue of mindfulness. And so, and then you just gave, I think, a major talk for the Academy of Poets. Is that right?
Yes.
Which I look forward to reading. But this deep recognition, not only by the public, which comes to some poets, but by your contemporaries, has been a profound mark of your work. And I want to ask something, which is, if you were a man, I mean, you got this incredible body of work, and I'm not sure, as a woman, that your work has been as recognized as it would be if you were a man. And I thought I'd ask you that question.
It is entirely possible that, you know, especially at the beginning, that might have won more prizes. But what's interesting to me now is that, you know, here I am at the farther side of the arc of a life. And what I am noticing is, you know, just now, I am being translated into more languages and recognized more in more countries. And I am so moved by that, because that was the world of poetry that the girl who bought a book of Japanese haiku was interested in. And that, you know, I have a major, you know, 2 selected poems, one of them rather large, out in Polish, and that was because Czesław Miłosz, you know, sort of tipped them off. You want this one. I've got, you know, both my books of essays and a new selected poem soon in China, being translated, as I mentioned, book coming out in Czechoslovakia, book in Norwegian. That's what matters. You know, prizes don't matter. The validation that people actually want to read my poems is really moving.
Well, and this is a time, yes, of women of diversity, so I can understand the trajectory is shifting. I just think, as you said, that at the beginning, it may well have been true.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows?
You also, Hirshfield's voice as a spokesperson for peace, justice, and environmental issues has become increasingly visible, with her work concluding the Library of America's War No More, 300 Years of American Anti-War and Peace Writing, and appearing in many other collections. And so we were talking about this before we came in, because within poetry, at least there used to be a controversy about movement poetry or activist poetry, and was it at the same level as many poets, American poets, contested as quote, pure poetry. In other words, that making something a political environmental poem rarely resulted. We took Guernica as an example of a piece of art that transcended its political context and became universal. But you had some very interesting things to say about how political, personal, and environmental poetry has now entered the mainstream, if I understood you, as equally valid to the poetry that, sort of pure poetry without such context.
Yeah. So it's interesting, Miłosz, who was one of the great political thinkers of the age, his prose book, The Captive Mind, described something very relevant to what happens in places in America today, of intellectuals basically selling their integrity in order to stay in positions of power in Poland, in post-war Poland. And he would regularly say, in his poems, statements to the effect of, oh, I should have been a pure poet merely writing about beauty and how awful it is that I could not manage to be that person because the times did not permit it. My own feeling about what is sometimes called the poetry of witness or engaged poetry or activist poetry is that good poems are good poems. And the hallmark of a good poem is it is not propaganda, slogan, or accusation. It is investigation, making visible with the underpinnings of interconnection and recognition of one's own part in things. And so, there's a little poem in here called Fecit, which is one of the environmental poems. And, that's the Church Latin pronunciation. On paintings, a Dürer print would have at the bottom, A.D. Fecit, made this. And my poem about the rising carbon dioxide levels in the air, its last line is J.H. Fecit, because I fly. I turn on my lights. I have heat in my house. I cook. I made this. I think I learned that from Miłosz, because Miłosz never accused anyone else of anything without including himself in the culpability. And that feels to me an honest stance for a poet to take. And so as poetry has expanded, starting the current version of it, starting in the Vietnam War protest poem era, and some of those poems were just terrible. Not every single one of them, but a lot were. And, there was this argument. And the argument, to me, seems a little foolish, because it's not a matter of subject matter. It's a matter of what's a good poem. And a good poem can be written probably about anything. And a bad poem can be written probably about anything. So because our world is in such tremendous crisis that anyone looking around knows now, if we don't mend our human ways, if we don't find a way to put our foundational hearts into the understanding of kinship, shared fate, interconnection, there is no boundary between us and them. You can't save yourself without saving all beings, to put it back in the Buddhist vocabulary. If we don't manage to do that, I don't see how we get through. And poems, good poems, are always recognitions and enactments of shared fate, of interconnection, of compassion. And I think that is, that is the tiny contribution that I hope I might make as a poet. It's not that I think that someone who is very eager in embracing, the various tribalisms of our age is going to read my poem and, have a come to Jesus moment. They won't. But I think culture is contagious. And that if we simply keep living and feeling and acting in the ways of recognition that we are all in this together, maybe that is what will gradually spread out like pouring ink into the ocean. Eventually the molecules of that ink, forgive me, ocean, maybe not the best environmental example to pick. Let's say it's biodegradable ink. Those molecules will spread out everywhere and maybe they will have some effect. Earlier in my life, I had different questions as my sort of primary, what was I trying to figure out in my life? And at this point, all I'm trying to figure out is, two things. One is I would like to keep writing poems, and that is an interior and personal discovery first. It is something I have to do. But the other question is, how can I serve? At this moment, how can I serve?
It's so interesting because at Commonweal, we deal a lot with the issue of political expression. And in the Cancer Help Program, these 220 week-long retreats that we've done over the last 37 years for people with cancer, we explicitly say that we leave politics at the door.
Yes.
That healing should be equally available to somebody who comes as an evangelical Christian, a Buddhist, a Palestinian, Israeli, whatever. So there's a way in which our healing work really does need to exclude the expression of tribalisms so there's a kind of an interesting parallel to the poetry issue. There was an article in a critical survey of poetry summarized the effect of Zen on Hirshfield's work. Little of her poetry is political in the usual sense of direct comment on specific issues, but all her work is political in the sense of integrating the stirrings of the heart with the political realities that surround people. Undoubtedly, the source of these characteristics of her poetry and for her very concept of what poetry is, quote, the magnification of being, derives from her strong Zen Buddhist training, her emphasis on compassion, on the pre-existent unity of subject and object, on nature, on the self-sufficient suchness of being, and on the daunting challenge of accepting transitoriness, as Peter Harris notes, are central themes in her poetry derived from Buddhism. Do you accept that premise that they're derived from Buddhism, or would you argue it?
I would say that there was something in me that drew me to Buddhism in the first place. And Buddhism for me was a vocabulary and a physical practice of many, intensive years of formal training that felt like the right way. But I don't think, if Buddhism were only Buddhism, it wouldn't be a human truth. And so I think, I could have as easily, in a different world, in a different time, maybe I would have, gone into Catholicism. Maybe I would have been a Benedictine oblate, or, any of 1,000 other possible traditions. I think the world's wisdom, at its best, is heart-opening and magnifying. And the particular vocabulary of practice a person enters is absolutely important, but also somewhat accidental.
Beautiful. I think we should begin to move toward a close of this part and then have some questions. I wonder if you would go back into this, perhaps read us a poem or two on the questions of death and dying that you mentioned. You had several others, and perhaps bring this part to a close with several of those.
I'd be happy to. Yeah.
Wonderful.
So the poems that I had chosen and didn't read, it's a set of poems. So these poems were all precipitated by the glioblastoma diagnosis and 3 years of living with and then death of my first great love. And some of them are more clearly about him, and some of them are poems of mortality consideration that arose in me because of what he was living through and I was living through with him. And we'd been apart for a long time, but we stayed extremely close through the end of his life and beyond. So the poems all take their opening line, except the very last one, from a poem that sounds so scholarly. The Roman Emperor Hadrian. We have one poem by him, written at the end of his life, saying goodbye to his life, in which he addressed it as little soul. It's a beautiful, very brief poem, goodbye, little soul, here you are, you're all pale and you're wandering, and where are you going to go now that we can't tell each other our old jokes? That's pretty much the poem. And I loved the tenderness of Little Soul. So the first of the series also has a Latin title, Amor Fati, which is love of fate, embrace of whatever happens to you. So, Amor Fati. Little soul, you have wandered lost a long time. The woods all dark now, birded and eyed. Then a light, a cabin, a fire, a door standing open. The fairy tales warn you, do not go in. You who would eat will be eaten. You go in, you quicken. You want to have feet. You want to have eyes. You want to have fears. So that's basically, yes, we sign on to it all by agreeing to live. The next one, kitchen. Little soul, how useful was hunger. From whatever it was we fell into, you and I, it sprang open our fingers' grip. Yet a life is not prepared for its ending like a sliced eggplant, salted and pressed to let leave from itself what is bitter. Snow. Little soul, for you too, death is coming. Was there something you thought you needed to do? Snow does not walk into a room and wonder why. Harness. Little soul, you and I will become the memory of a memory of a memory. A horse released of the traces forgets the weight of the wagon. Pelt. Little soul, the book of your hours is closing over its golds, its reds, your gazing dog, your rivers, ladders, ribcage. A life turns into its patterns and perfumes, then into its pelt. I don't know now if we were one, if we were two, a stippling. Whither thou goest, wheat said. Rust flakes on wind. Little soul, a day comes when retrospection ceases. A person falling does not mid-plummet look up. Still, for a few days on Wednesday, where are my truck keys? On Thursday, on Sunday, where are my truck keys? Wood, salt, tin. Little soul, do you remember? You once walked over wooden boards to a house that sat on stilts in the sea. It was early. The sun painted brightness onto the water, and wherever you sat, that path led directly to you. Some mornings the sea road was muted, scratched tin. Some mornings, blinding. Then it would leave. Little soul, it is strange. Even now, it is early. And the last one, very short. I said, I believed a world without you unimaginable. Now cutting its flowers to go with you into the fire.
Let's just go quiet for a minute. Jane Hirshfield, thank you for being with us at the New School.
Thank you.
Such a joy. Let's have a few questions. I'd ask you to keep them succinct so that we have time for several people.
Thank you. I always learn a great deal from these conversations. And I did want to say, too, that I'm perplexed and I don't understand why you would say you are not a narrator, because you do, from your first line to the last line, transition and take us with you on a story. So thank you, and I do think of you as a narrative poet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's just a more generous interpretation of narration rather than, oh, when I was a child, my father did this and my mother did that, and I went out and did that. But I am perfectly happy to receive your definition of narrative. It just means something that an experience unfolds. Yes. And yes, I would hope so. Thank you.
Other comments?
There's one from the webinar.
Yeah.
It's Steve Heilig, one of our New School hosts, and he asks if Jane has written any haiku of late, and might she share one? And if she hasn't written any, why not?
I write many very short poems. I have written perhaps 3 haiku in my life because I loved and respected them so much, and the same with tanka, the slightly longer form, that I felt as if I should not imitate a form that I loved so much. I translate or co-translate them with Mariko Aratani, but I have hardly ever written either of them because I had to not become that, and I loved it so much I would have become that. And that, I cast no shade on the American haiku writing community. They are actually doing brilliant work. I don't think I could have been as good a haiku writer as so many of them are. But what I attempted to do was to find a hybrid form that was very short, but absolutely not haiku. I call them pebbles. And they marry my great love of the brevity of those forms with the Western tradition's way of speaking, thinking, and feeling. So I can give you,
yes,
one or two of those. So since the question was for recent ones, I would have given you something else, but there are 5 of them in this book. I'll give you 3 of them. So here and now. Try to describe it. So try to describe this present moment, here and now. Try to describe it. Even one quick line drawn with unlifted pencil, already wrong. My failure, I said of the view, just some trees. Oh, I felt so badly. You know, how could I, just some trees? It's a terrible thing to say. And the last one I'll give you of these 5 is a poem written during the fire season a couple of years ago when we had so much ash falling. Vestment. For the pear, for the fig, no difference. They ripen even in ash fall.
Beautiful. Thank you all for coming. It's been a complete joy.
Thank you.
And for those who are online, thanks for being with us. Jane Hirshfield, I'm so grateful. I was quite overcome with your work and approached this conversation with a certain trepidation about my capacity to be with you, and I'm grateful that you share this space with me and a friendship that I hope will continue to deepen. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for welcoming me into your home, your heart, your reading, your time, your eloquence, your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to you all. Joy.
Don't take it, 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 don't take it,
The river is a healer, the river is a sage. The river knows no end and the river feels no way.